The hush in the orchid house was a living thing, a palpable blanket of humidity and suspended breath. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic hiss of the misting system and the occasional reverent tap of my husband's shears as he deadheaded a spent bloom. Elias was the head botanist of the Vandermeer Conservatory, a man who spoke to plants in a language of pH and lumens, and who loved me, I believed, with the same meticulous, controlled tenderness. Our life was a series of perfect, measured conditions. We lived in the head curator's cottage on the conservatory grounds, a quaint stone house filled with botanical prints and the clean green scent of health. Our love was a rare hybrid he had nurtured, predictable, beautiful, and perpetually in bloom. I was Alara, the botanist's wife, a former horticulture student whose own ambitions had gently atrophied into being his quiet assistant, his recorder of data, the keeper of his domestic greenhouse. I mistook the absence of blight for the presence of true vitality. My own small rebellion was a patch of unruly cottage garden behind the cottage, a space Elias allowed with benign bemusement. Here I grew poppies and lupines and fever-few messy sprawling things that seeded where they wished and often failed to thrive. They were my secret confession, a preference for wild imperfection over curated perfection. The crack in my glass world appeared in the form of a delivery truck and a bark of laughter that shattered the orchid house's sacred quiet. I was cataloging a new shipment of Paphiopedilum from Borneo when I heard it, a deep, unapologetic sound that seemed to shake the very fronds of the ferns. A man stood arguing with our stock manager, gesturing with hands that were nicked and stained with earth. He was delivering a specialized growing medium, a volcanic rock mixture, but the invoice was wrong. "Look," he said, his voice a gravelly roll, "the paperwork says 2 cubic meters of pumice. My truck holds 5. You ordered 5 last year. Your ferns are either starving or you're planning a very small volcano." "Which is it?" The manager flustered. The man, his name tag read Kyle, simply grinned, a flash of white in a face tanned and weathered by outdoor work. He had eyes the color of a stormy sea and hair that looked like he'd forgotten a hat for a decade. He smelled not of soil, but of rock dust, diesel, and something fiercely, fundamentally outdoors. He was a geologist, he explained when the manager went to check the records, but he ran a small business sourcing and delivering specialized mineral substrates for exotic growers. "I'm a dirt merchant," he said, turning that disarming grin on me. "And you look like you're drowning in all this humidity." I was holding a delicate orchid, its roots exposed. His directness was a shock. "They're epiphytes. They prefer it." "Maybe," he said, his gaze dropping to the plant in my hands, then back to my face. "But you're not an epiphyte, are you? You look like you belong in a meadow, not a terrarium." It was an observation so personal, so absurdly accurate, it left me speechless. Elias saw me as part of the conservatory's ecosystem. This stranger saw a displacement. He started making deliveries every few months. Our interactions were brief but charged. He'd find me, whether I was in the tropical palm house or the arid succulent gallery. He'd comment on the plants with a geologist's irreverent perspective. "See this cactus? It's not stubborn. It's just waiting for a better epoch." Or, "These ferns, so lush, like they're trying to forget they're descended from something that once fought dinosaurs." He spoke of deep time, of tectonic shifts, of mountains rising and eroding. His world was one of colossal, slow-moving power and inevitable decay, a stark contrast to Elias's world of precise, life-sustaining stasis. I began to look forward to the rumble of his truck. His visits became secret, shining nodes in the calendar of my monotonous days. The first betrayal was a thought seed, planted during one of his deliveries. He'd brought a load of porous limestone for our alpine collection. As we stood in the cool, dry, artificial mountainside, he picked up a small, sharp piece of rock. "This," he said, placing it in my palm. It was cool and rough. "Was once at the bottom of a sea. Now it's here, pretending to be a mountain. Everything is just in a temporary form, waiting for the next great shove." He closed my fingers over it. "Keep it. A reminder that nothing is permanent, not even rock." I hid the limestone shard in the pocket of my gardening apron. Its presence was a secret, a solid piece of his chaotic philosophy lodged against my thigh. That night, when Elias described his breakthrough in inducing a rare Dracula simia to flower, I nodded and smiled, my hand in my pocket, clenched around the fossilized sea. The second betrayal was temporal. Kyle asked if I'd ever seen the actual source of his pumice and old quarry on the coast, now flooded and eerily beautiful. It's like the moon fell into the ocean, he said. I told Elias I was visiting an old university friend for a weekend, a woman I'd hardly spoken to in years. The lie was a sickly, tender shoot I nurtured with anxious care. The quarry was a gash in the world, a cathedral of shattered rock and deep, still, turquoise water. It was raw, wild, utterly untamed. We sat on a ledge, our feet dangling. He didn't try to kiss me. He talked about the violence of its formation, the peace of its abandonment. We spend so much time building little controlled environments, he said, gesturing back towards the world of conservatories and cottages, trying to keep the wild out. But the wild is the only true thing. It's where life fights, not just exists. I felt something in me, something long pruned and staked, strained towards the sun of that idea. With Elias, I existed. With Kyle in that brutal, beautiful place, I felt, for the first time in years, that I might be capable of fighting. The physical affair began in his rented cottage near the quarry, a place of unvarnished wood, maps on the walls, and a pervasive, pleasant smell of dust and coffee. It was not making love, it was a collision. He kissed me as if he were trying to taste the earth on me, his hands rough and sure on my skin, which had only known gentle touches. He called me his wildflower, a name that felt like a liberation and a lie. I was not wild. I was a cultivated thing playing at being feral. But in his bed, with the sound of wind buffeting the windows, I could almost believe the character he'd assigned me. Afterwards, I cried. He held me, his chin rough against my temple. Shh, he murmured. It's just the shock of real weather. You've been under glass too long. He framed my guilt as a necessary climate shock. I clung to that. It allowed me to see my deceit not as a moral failure, but as a biological imperative, a hothouse flower suddenly thrust into fresh air. Thus began my double life as a living paradox. I was the botanist's wife, tending to the most delicate organisms on Earth, while secretly trying to become a weed in the cracks of my own marriage. I kept two sets of notes: the official ledger, fertilization schedules, humidity logs, grocery lists for our perfectly balanced meals. The secret journal, hidden inside a hollowed-out textbook on plant pathology, fragmented, feverish entries about the smell of rock dust, the feeling of quarry water on my skin, the weight of Kale's body. He says I have roots that crave deeper, poorer soil. The logistics were a constant, stressful propagation. I kept a spare set of clothes jeans, a simple cotton shirt, sturdy boots in a locker at the local garden center. I bought a cheap mobile phone, a burner he called it, and kept it switched off and buried in a bag of potting soil in my shed. I became an expert in alibis, attending a lecture on peat-free compost, helping a friend design a perennial border, long walks to clear my head. Elias, whose trust was as deep and unshakable as a taproot, accepted it all. His concern was purely practical. Take your phone, darling, and a jacket. The microclimate in the valley can be unpredictable. The guilt was a creeping vine that threatened to strangle me. It would flower violently at moments of Elias's unconscious devotion. When he proudly showed me a new AI-driven irrigation system he'd coded for the tropical biomes. When he gently brushed a stray hair from my face as we pored over seed catalogs. When he talked about our future, about building a private conservatory attached to our cottage, a sanctuary for just us and the things we love. His love was a perfect, sustained nutrient solution. My betrayal was a toxin leaching into the reservoir. To survive, I began to unconsciously introduce stress into my marriage. I'd forget to miss the rare ferns in his study, letting their fronds crisp. I'd play music with a driving, discordant rhythm during our quiet evenings. I was trying to create an environment where my own infidelity could be seen as a symptom, not a cause, a desperate plant etiolating for lack of light, rather than one willingly climbing out the window. Cale's world was all stress. His life was boom and bust, feast and famine, depending on contracts. He was passionate, impatient, gloriously unstable. He took me to see ancient stone circles on rain-lashed moors, to hidden waterfalls that required scrambling down muddy cliffs. He loved me with a hungry, consuming energy that felt like being devoured by sunlight. With him, I felt necessary in a primal way, the witness to his solitude, the softness to his hardness. With Elias, I was a compatible species in a carefully planned companion planting. Elias, the master observer, began to note the changes in his most sensitive specimen. Me. Not evidence, but symptoms. The new restless energy in my limbs. The distant look in my eyes when I thought he wasn't looking. The subtle, unfamiliar scent on my skin sometimes. Not perfume, but something mineral, outdoor. "You seem different lately, Alara," he said one evening, looking up from his microscope where he was studying a fungal pathogen. His voice was gentle, concerned. "Are you feeling quite yourself? Not coming down with anything? Your circadian rhythms seem disrupted." He was diagnosing me, and he was not entirely wrong. "I'm just a little tired," I said, forcing a smile. "Maybe too much time in the artificial light." He nodded slowly, but his gaze was that of a scientist who has spotted an anomaly in a controlled experiment. "Perhaps you need more time in your own garden with the poppies." He said the word as if it were a slightly dangerous, uncontrolled variable. The crisis was precipitated by a literal blight. A fast-moving, unidentified fungus began to attack the prized orchid collection in the main display house. It was Elias's nightmare. He moved into the conservatory, working around the clock, a general fighting a silent, spreading war. The atmosphere at home was tense, electric with his preoccupied anxiety. It was during this siege that Kale texted, "Quarry at midnight. The moon on the water is a crime to miss." The audacity of it, the romantic pull, was irresistible. Elias was literally fighting to save his life's work. I told him I was going to the all-night pharmacy in town to get him stronger coffee and supplies. He barely looked up from his laptop, his face lit by the glow of pathogen maps. "Thank you, darling. Be careful." The quarry under a full moon was a spectral, silver dreamscape. It was also freezing. We huddled under a blanket, sharing a flask of whiskey, watching the light dance on the obsidian water. The contrast between Elias's desperate, sterile battle and this raw, beautiful escapism was so extreme it felt like madness. That night, with Kyle, I felt a wild, reckless freedom that bordered on derangement. We made love on the cold rock, and it felt less like passion and more like a ritual sacrifice of the woman I had been. I returned home at 3 a.m., chilled to the bone, smelling of whiskey and night air. The cottage was dark, but a light was on in the conservatory. I assumed Elias was still there. I crept into the shower, scrubbing the scent of the quarry from my skin. I came out in my robe to find him sitting at the kitchen table. He wasn't in his lab coat. He was in his dressing gown. He was holding my burner phone. It was buzzing on the table, Cal's name flashing on the screen with a heart emoji. He must have been looking for a spare charger or a notebook and had found the phone in its bag of soil. The discovery was so absurd, so amateurish, it was almost funny. It wasn't. He looked from the buzzing phone to me, his face a mask of utter, profound shock. It was the look of a man who has just watched a rare, cherished, thousand-year-old bonsai tree spontaneously combust. "Who?" he asked, his voice a dried-out leaf crumbled to dust. "Is the invasive species?" The metaphor was perfect, botanical, and devastating. He understood the affair not as a simple betrayal, but as an ecological catastrophe. A foreign agent introduced into a closed, perfect system, threatening everything. There was no point in lying. The evidence was buzzing between us. I confessed. Standing there in my robe with damp hair, I gave him the taxonomical breakdown of my deceit. Kale, the quarry, the geology, the sex on rock, the lies. I presented the full, ugly specimen. As I spoke, I watched the ecosystem of his heart die. His face, usually a landscape of calm focus, collapsed through disbelief into a silent, vegetal ruin. I hadn't just broken a vow. I had proven that his entire philosophy control, care, perfect conditions was useless against the chaotic, contaminating force of human desire. I was the blight. When my voice finally failed, he stood. He walked to the window overlooking my cottage garden, where the poppies were just starting to form tight, furry buds. I dedicated my life to understanding conditions, he said, his back to me, to creating environments where fragile, beautiful things could not just survive, but thrive. I believed love was the ultimate act of cultivation. He turned and his eyes were hollow, the green of them seeming to have leached away. But you, Alara, you were not the orchid I thought you were. You were the weed in the orchid's pot all along. You craved the neglect, the poor soil, the harsh weather. I was loving you the wrong way. And there is no way to love a weed except to let it go wild, or to pull it out, root and stem. I cannot do the former. And the latter destroys the pot. He left that night. His packing was a swift clinical excision. He took his research, his microscope, the photograph of us standing before the giant Amazonian water lily on our honeymoon. He left the cottage, the furniture, every carefully tended object of our life. I don't want any of it, he said at the door. The environment is corrupted. The aftermath was a long, sterile, fallow period. Elias communicated only through the conservatory's lawyers. The divorce was a clean, surgical separation of assets. He was scrupulously fair, which felt like the coldest cut of all. My father, a retired agronomist who saw Elias as the pinnacle of intelligent husbandry, was ashamed. You were a prized cultivar, Ilara, and you let yourself be transplanted into a ditch. Weeks later, the orchid blight was contained. I went to the quarry one last time, needing the man who had mistaken me for a wildflower. I found his cottage empty, a for let sign slapped on the gate. A neighbor said he'd taken a contract overseas. Geological survey in Chile, I think. Said he was sick of the rain. There was no note, no forward. I was just another landscape he'd passed through, interesting for its formations, but not a place to build a life. The wildness I had craved was, by its nature, nomadic. I left the cottage and the conservatory. I could no longer bear the smell of damp soil, the sight of anything growing. I moved to a small top-floor flat in a concrete city suburb, a place with a barren balcony where nothing grew. I took a job as a clerk in a sterile, air-conditioned office, my world reduced to spreadsheets and fluorescent light. Now I live in a state of permanent dormancy. The silence here is not the fertile green hush of the conservatory, but the dead quiet of a terminated experiment. Sometimes I see a potted plant in a supermarket or a splash of weeds in a pavement crack, and a pain so acute it feels like root rot seizes my chest. I sought to trade a perfect, glassed-in life for the fierce, authentic struggle of the wild. But I was never a wild thing. I was a delicate, dependent organism who foolishly romanticized the storm, and in experiencing it, was broken, desiccated, and left unable to thrive in any climate at all. I am the botanist's ex-wife, a failed hybrid, a lesson in the catastrophic consequences of misidentifying your own nature.